Today, we're stepping back into a really pivotal moment in American history, the U.S. presidential election of 1916.
That's right, and our source for this is an excerpt called The Election of 1916, Peace and War.
And our mission really is to pull out the key insights from this text. We want to understand, what made this particular election so dramatic, so consequential.
Okay, so let's set the scene. It's 1916,
Right.
and over in Europe, the Great War, World War I is just this meat grinder. Unbelievable brutality.
Yeah, you're talking trenches, horrible new weapons, millions dying. It's a nightmare.
A total nightmare. And the crucial thing for our story is the U.S. position. President Woodrow Wilson, the incumbent Democrat, he'd managed somehow to keep the U.S. out of it, officially neutral.
But that neutrality was feeling pretty shaky, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Under enormous strain, German submarine warfare was a huge issue.
And just the year before, in 1915, the Lusitania sinking, that really hit home. Over 100 Americans died.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That sparked outrage, strained relations badly. You just couldn't ignore what was happening across the Atlantic anymore. It was definitely shaping how people felt.
So this really puts the central question of the election right out there, doesn't it?
It really does. For Americans, it was. How long can we realistically stay out of this war?
And maybe even more importantly, who's the right leader to navigate this mess? Who do you trust?
That fundamental tension just defines this whole race.
Okay, so let's look at the incumbent first. Woodrow Wilson, Democrat.
Yep. Former academic, Princeton president, governor, known as a progressive reformer, and, as our source notes, deeply committed to peace.
His first term wasn't all foreign policy, though, right? Even if that came to dominate.
Not at all. He'd actually pushed through some big domestic stuff. The Federal Reserve System, the Federal Trade Commission.
Regulating business.
Right. And some key labor laws, too. He definitely had a progressive track record.
But come 1916, it's all about the war. And his campaign, well, they found this incredibly powerful slogan.
He kept us out of war.
Yeah.
Simple. Direct.
And potent. Became the absolute cornerstone of his whole re-election bid.
And you can see why it worked. It resonated deeply with a lot of people. The Democratic argument was basically, Wilson is the steady hand. He gets diplomacy. He values American lives.
Don't change horses midstream, essentially.
Exactly. They framed it as, changing leaders now will almost certainly drag the U.S. into the fighting.
And for a country watching that horror show in Europe, well, peace sounded pretty good.
Immensely appealing, especially, the source says, in the Midwest and the West. Lots of isolationist feeling out there. Peace felt like, the moral thing to do for many.
Okay, so who was challenging Wilson, the Republican?
That was Charles Evans Hughes, a very distinguished figure, former governor of New York.
And here's the wild part. Our source highlights he was actually an associate justice of the Supreme Court when he accepted the nomination.
Yeah, can you imagine resigning from the Supreme Court to run for president?
It says a lot about how people saw him and maybe how serious the situation felt.
Definitely speaks to his standing. Seen as strong, upright, progressive himself, actually.
Yeah.
And his big job, beyond just taking on Wilson, was to unite the Republicans.
Ah, right, because Teddy Roosevelt had split the party back in 1912 with his Bull Moose run.
Precisely. That split let Wilson win easily. So Hughes had to bring the party back together, the conservatives and the Roosevelt progressives.
So the Republicans, they couldn't just campaign on let's jump into the war, could they? That wasn't going to fly.
No, not politically viable at all. So their strategy was more indirect. They went after Wilson's handling of foreign policy.
How so?
They painted his neutrality as weak, sort of wishy-washy, indecisive. Said he wasn't really protecting American interests or rights strongly enough, that he didn't have a clear plan.
So Hughes had this tricky balancing act.
A very difficult line to walk. He had to criticize Wilson's approach, talk about preparedness, but without explicitly saying, we need to fight.
Did they talk about anything else? Domestic stuff?
Oh, yeah. They touched on things like economic efficiency, military preparedness, getting stronger just in case.
Yeah.
But the main Republican argument against Wilson's peace was essentially that it was fake.
Fake. Or maybe just fragile.
Fragile, yeah. An illusion, maybe. Bought by sacrificing national honor and maybe risking future security. It was a different perspective on the whole war question.
The source mentions the campaign trail was intense. These guys were practically living on trains.
Oh, absolutely. Whistle-stop tours, giving speeches constantly, big crowds all over the country.
A totally different kind of campaigning than today.
Very different. Newspapers were everything for coverage. Rallies were where you saw the candidates. And the economy mattered too, of course. War orders from Europe were boosting U.S. industry.
But also causing worries. Inflation.
Yeah, concerns about inflation, maybe some social unrest. So both sides were making appeals to farmers, workers, business folks, promising prosperity, stability.
Okay, now we get to this anecdote, the one historians often point to as maybe being decisive, the California gaffe.
Right, this is a classic campaign trail story. It shows how tiny things, or perceived tiny things, can blow up in a close election.
So what happened? Hughes was campaigning in California.
Crucial state.
Yeah.
And somehow, he managed to apparently snub the state's powerful Republican governor, Hiram Johnson.
Snub him.
How? Well, the accounts vary a bit, as the source notes. Maybe he deliberately avoided Johnson. Maybe it was just a scheduled mess-up. They were the same city, Long Beach, but didn't connect.
But whatever the actual details.
The perception stuck. Johnson felt slighted. He was a major progressive figure, key to winning California. And word is, after this perceived disrespect, he basically sat on his hands. Didn't lift a finger to help Hughes in California.
Ouch. In a race that turned out to be incredibly close. Losing that kind of support in a big state.
Hugely damaging, which leads us right into election night. November 7th, 1916. What a night.
A real nail-biter, wasn't it?
It started out looking like a Hughes landslide, actually. The early returns, mostly from the East, heavily favored him.
And the source points out this amazing detail. Newspapers, big ones like the New York Times, actually printed early editions declaring Hughes the winner.
Yeah. Headline screaming, Hughes elected. Imagine waking up to that thinking it's over.
Talk about jumping the gun.
Totally. But then, as the night dragged on, results started trickling in from the West. Slower counts back then.
And the picture started to shift.
Dramatically.
The
margins got tighter and tighter.
And California, because it was so close and reported late, it became the state everyone was watching.
The absolute pivot point. The count there was agonizingly close. In the end, Wilson won California by, get this, fewer than 4,000 votes.
Wow, that's razor thin.
Incredibly thin. And California had 13 electoral votes.
And those 13 votes were just enough.
Just enough. They pushed Wilson over the 266 electoral votes needed to win.
So the New York Times had to eat crow and print a retraction. Amazing.
One of the closest, most dramatic elections ever. It showed just how divided the country was, how anxious people were about the war. Wilson won by only 23 electoral votes in the end. California decided it.
So the immediate takeaway was clear, right? Wilson won. He kept us out of war. Worked.
That was the interpretation, yeah. A mandate for peace. America seemed to have voted to stay out.
And then history throws that curveball. The great irony.
The ultimate irony. That mandate for peace. It barely lasted 5 months.
5 months. What happened?
Well, circumstances just took over. Germany decided to resume unrestricted submarine warfare in early 1917, started sinking American ships again.
And then there was the Zimmerman telegram.
Exactly. That intercepted message where Germany tried to get Mexico to ally with them against the U.S. if America entered the war, that caused uproar.
So Wilson's hand was forced.
Pretty much. On April 6, 1917, less than 6 months after winning re-election on a peace platform, President Wilson went to Congress and asked for a declaration of war.
Incredible. The man who kept them out of war led them into it.
The significance is just stark, isn't it? The will of the people, expressed in that election, however narrowly, it was just overwhelmed by global events, overturned by the reality of World War I.
So this deep dive, looking at 1916, it really shows you the power of a slogan, how campaigns work under pressure.
How tiny margins, like that California vote, can literally change history.
And how massive global forces can just completely upend domestic politics and intentions.
It's a really poignant chapter. That complex dance between what a nation wants and what the world forces upon it.
And it leaves you with this final thought, doesn't it? You have an election where America seemingly makes a choice, peace,
A conscious choice at the ballot box.
only to find itself plunged into that very war just months later. What does that tell us about the limits of political will when faced with, well, unstoppable global events?
That's the question that lingers, isn't it?
Yeah, it really does.